So we're coming to a head here on our discussion of Blender render materials, which we are currently in the Blender render engine. And in the last couple of videos, we talked about textures, which the hierarchy goes, textures live inside of materials and materials go on your objects. As far as Blender goes, a lot of the time we can sort of get stuck in this mindset that textures just exist to house images for our materials, but in reality, a lot of communication goes back and forth between textures you use and the actual material in terms of its shading settings such as specularity, diffuse, color, transparency, reflectivity, all that sort of thing. If we go ahead and press new to give this cube a new default white material here in Blender Render, we'll see a bunch of different settings here. And we have a very similar set of settings for the textures we give our Blender Render materials. If I press new to give this material a new texture, and those similar settings to the material settings for textures are found in this influence menu. Of course, to see any of these in action, we're going to need to actually load an image into this texture, or else use a procedural texture, which you can change here up where it says type. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and load an image into this texture. For our image examples today, we're just going to be using the Seamless Elemental Brush Pack Sample Pack, which you can get for free at blendersensei.com. This is 25 of a set of 300 and at half resolution. Okay, so if you haven't got those already, head over to blendersensei.com/store and download those for free. I'm going to back here in Blender, press open, and go over to where I have this folder here. And you may want to click this button up here if you're not already in thumbnail view so you can see these. I'm going to click on this wallstone castle image here. Two things going on here as to why we can't see the image on the object yet. One is that here in the main 3D view, we are currently in solid viewport shading. So we would need to switch this to material or texture. But typically I just use material. I find almost no reason to use texture. Texture is just a gimped version of material. So we can press Alt-Z to switch between solid and material viewport shading. But down here in the camera view, which is always in material viewport shading, we still can't see it. And that's because currently there is no UV map on this object. So if I come over here to the object's properties and I press UV maps here, we'll see there's nothing in this selection menu. Okay, so to create a UV map, let's just press Tab to go into edit mode. We can either press T to bring up our tool shelf and click on our edge tools, and just press unwrap here, or you can use the hotkey of U to bring up the unwrap menu, which is this same menu right down here. Now normally you would want to spend some time and some thought marking seams on your object before you unwrapped it, which is, as I've mentioned several times before, sort of similar to the process of taxidermying an animal. You sort of have to figure out the cut lines on your object where you want them to go in preparation for having basically the skin of that object laid flat so you can then be able to paint it or do whatever with it. But for an object as simple as this cube, we're just going to go ahead and do a simple unwrap. Let's press this and just press regular unwrap here. And as soon as we do, down here in the camera view, which is always in material viewport shading by default, we can see the texture now on this cube. And if I press Alt-Z here in the main 3D view, we can also see it on the cube as well. So to give you sort of an idea of just how simple of a UV map was created without marking the seams, we can either go to the image editor here, or we can just use this quick button to edit our UVs. And you'll see here that this is the UV map belonging to this cube. And it's actually just a series of all the faces of the cube just stacked one right on top of the next. So if I switch this to island selection mode and press G and select these and press G to grab, for one, you can see down here the placement of the image moving around as I move the part of the UV map. And if we were to switch this to the actual image, the wallstone castle here, we can see in correlation to what's actually going on there. But without marking seams, it basically is just going to stack everything on top of itself. Dealing with UV maps and unwrapping and all that sort of thing can be a bit of a pain, and it's sort of whitewashed over sometimes, and not a lot of attention is given to it, but it can really make or break your designs, your models, and things like that. So just be aware that sometimes you will have to put quite a bit of work into UV maps to get them to work for objects that aren't, super simple. That is, of course, if you are planning ahead to use images that already exist, such as this stone image here. Press go back here, and under this unwrap menu, I'm going to press reset, which will give us our simple just face stacked on top of each face ultra simple UV map here, which turns out to be what we need for this simple cube object, and press go back. Okay, so now that we've got that unwrapped, we can close this up, press T to dismiss our tools. And back here over on our texture menu of the properties panel, we'll close up where it says image here and open influence. So some of these influence options can be a little confusing. Getting them to work sometimes requires adjusting settings in the actual material itself. So the thing to remember when you're working with these influence options, which are basically the same as the material options for the whole material, is that if something's not working in here, then it probably means something needs to be adjusted in the material itself. So we've got diffuse settings, which is stuff to do with your basic colors and surface properties. So in the same way on the actual material, we have this intensity slider. We can also control this via this particular texture. If I click on this, and notice that if I try to adjust this, we don't see any real change in here. That goes back to what I was saying, where a lot of times if you want the texture to be able to have control over the material, then you've got to bring down the values of the material itself. So now that we have the material intensity down, we can control the intensity via this texture influence button. The color slider, this controls the transparency of the color values, so we could actually turn that all the way down. And so now we're not seeing any of the color of this texture, but if in the material settings, I were to switch the color to say green or something like that, we can now see that. But if I bring this color value back up, if I bring it all the way back up to 1, we see nothing but this particular texture, or we can have some sort of, in-between level there between the material color and the color coming from our texture. This alpha value here, alpha of course controls transparency, but this isn't going to really do anything for us unless we have transparency enabled for the material itself. So if we click back on the material, notice this transparency option here. If we turn that on, and open this up and bring the alpha value down to 0. Much in the same way, to control the texture intensity values, we had to bring it to 0. We have to bring the material values down for this alpha as well. So if I come over here, now that I brought that down, I can control the alpha value of this texture. So say I were to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a monkey, press W to a few times give it some smoothing here, and click back on this, I can bring this alpha value down. We can see the monkey actually inside this cube. Notice that we can only see it when we have it selected. However, when you go to do a render preview, or you go to actually render your scene, you'll see the full transparency there. If we were to, under the material tab, under transparency, if we were to turn this setting from Z transparency to Raytrace, which Raytrace is pretty much going to be your go-to when you need the transparent material to act like glass or water or something. It's going to give those cool kind of glass reflections as opposed to just a dull basic transparency. Of course, it costs a little more in terms of resources, but the effects can be really cool. So with this set to Raytrace, if we press the render preview button here and we adjust this IOR value, which stands for index of refraction, which basically this is going to control like how deep it makes the glass or the water or whatever you're using look, like how thick it is. So there we can see this kind of Suzanne head bouncing off the sides here of our stone box here, which is kind of neat. All right, enough of that. So let's turn that off there, and I'll go ahead and switch that back to Z transparency, then back under our texture tab. Translucency, this is another one of those effects that we can only really see when doing a render preview. So if we were to turn it on and adjust it, we don't see anything, but if we're render previewing, or if we were to actually, of course, press the render button to do a real render, we can see its effects. So if we bring this down, this affects, even further the transparency value here. So we can go ahead and turn off translucency and go ahead and bring this alpha value back up to 1. So under the shading menu, this ambient value is supposed to control how much ambient shading the texture will use, but I haven't really found a way to make this useful. So for instance, if I were to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a torus, press S to scale, press W a few times to give it some smoothing. And so if down here, under lights, we turn on ambient, and of course we can see it live in the 3D view, but if we were to press render preview, which gives us as sort of a closer image of what we'll get when we do our final render. We can see the ambient occlusion going on there, the shading being cast from this torus onto the cube. So I'll go ahead and turn that off for now, click back on the cube here. So what's supposed to happen if I enable this is supposed to let me control how much ambient shading this texture will take, but I'm having trouble getting this to work. I'm not sure if this is a bug or some misunderstanding of mine. And the emit value, this is basically glow. If we were to turn that on, we can immediately see the object glowing there. Now here in Blender Render, we're only going to see the texture itself light up, and it won't actually be casting light onto other objects unless we, under the World tab, turn on indirect lighting and change this gather method to approximate. And now, if we go ahead and under lights, under scene brightness, turn our regular scene lights down and press render preview, we can now see this texture actually casting light onto other objects. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, under mesh, add a plane, press render preview again, and we can see this light casting onto both the ground plane and that torus. So where this gets a lot cooler for the emit value is if we just had a texture on here which, was only emitting from specific areas rather than the entire thing. Then you can use that, like say you had a texture for some kind of spaceship or something, you could have only areas with like small lights on it that you wanted it to be shining off and stuff like that. So I'll go ahead and turn that off and bring my scene brightness back up. So these mirror values here, well, for starters, these values are only going to display while rendering or render previewing. And also under our material settings, in the same way, to get the alpha value to work, we have to have it turned on for the material. We have to have the mirror value turned on for these mirror texture options for this specific texture here to work. So also this reflectivity value, which is at 0 by default, needs to be down to 0. But back here, with this turned on, if we go ahead and turn on ray mirror, because this is what's actually going to control the mirror value of this texture. This other value that misleadingly says mirror, this controls the color value of the mirror. So I'll show you what that means in a second. So right now, if we press our render preview button, with this mirror value all the way up to 1, this texture becomes just basically a total reflective surface. But if we were to bring that down some, we're now getting a mix of the actual texture itself and the mirror reflections. If, say, under the material option, say we had this reflectivity value all the way up here, if that was the case, we would have no control over this at all. Much like the alpha values for the material, you want the reflectivity values all the way down so that the texture has a chance to actually manipulate things. Okay, so in addition to control over the actual mirror value there, we can turn this on, which gives us control over the mirror color value. With this on, I can actually bring this up full value, and so this just gives us additional control over the reflective value of the mirror. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and shut these off. With specular settings, of course, specularity is referring to shininess. And when we're talking about the shininess of something, what will end up really affecting that is what lights are around, what position are those lights, how are they being pointed at the object. Also, the specularity of objects with rounded edges will show up a bit better. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and press W about 3 times on this cube to give it a bunch of smoothing, then press Tab to go into edit mode, and press W 2 times to subdivide the whole cube itself, which gives it more rigidity and makes the subsurface modifier that we just added by pressing W take on more of its original form there. So down here with our specular values, so first of all we have intensity. This intensity value is really only going to affect the texture if it is a black and white specular map, which this is not. So this isn't really going to have an effect on our specularity of this object, which of course when we say specular, what we really mean is shininess, the parts of the object which appear shiny. I'll turn that off for now because we're not using an actual specular map. But If we turn on the color value, we can control how much the colored areas of the texture are absorbed or send off light, which you can see when we have this value activated and increase this, we get some nice highlights moving around a little bit of the edges of the stones on this image. We can control the hardness value as well. And once again, these values are going to be working in tandem with the overall material's specular values here. So just keep that in mind. So you're probably familiar with the term bump map, which can create a faux 3D effect on our textures. So if we turn on this normal value, this will allow us to control the bump value of this texture, which is really sweet. One thing you may not be aware of is just how much the specular values will really affect the way that this bump map will look. So just by adjusting this color value here, we can totally change the way the highlights and things pop off of the bump effect of this. Also, this normal value, we talked about how this specular intensity value is only going to show up if we're using an actual specular map. If we're using an actual normal map as opposed to just a regular image and using this normal effect, we can get some, really interesting results with that as well. And below that, we have displace, which right now we're using normal mapping on this texture, which is sort of a faux 3D effect. I mean, it looks really cool. It makes the texture appear as though it's got a lot more geometric detail in it when actually it doesn't. However, this displace option can actually create geometry based on the actual lightness and darkness of the image itself. However, it is another one of those things that you're only going to be able to see when you are either render previewing or do an actual render. So if we turn this on, and we come down here and we press render preview, we can see this displacement value popping up mesh out of the lightness and darkness values of this stone texture. Now, typically when you're using this, you want to use like smooth image maps. So maybe if you're going to use something like this stone texture, you would have already blurred it out a lot in Photoshop or something like that. And also a black and white maps work best with this. The other thing going on here is that the displacement map can only affect the geometry, the mesh that is on the object. It can't actually generate new mesh. So it's got to use whatever is already on there. What's cool is it can at least use the values from subsurface modifier. So if we were to click on our modifier tab, we can tap W to increase this, or we can just manually click on this. The more we increase the subdivisions of our cube object here, the more mesh, the more geometry that the displacement value actually has to work with. You can see here it's getting really messy though. So what we need to do is go back to the texture tab and make sure we click on the material icon of the texture tab, which lets us adjust the textures belonging to this material and not like the world environment or brushes or something. So make sure we're on that. Let's turn off the mirror and the transparency values of the material. Click back on the texture tab so we have our influence options. Let's press render preview again. So I think actually what's going on here is that while this displacement value is active, it does not like using the normal value here. So if we disable that and give this a second, yeah, this looks a lot better, and we can actually increase this displacement value. Here we go. So yeah, whereas the normal value was creating a faux 3D effect, this displacement value is actually adjusting the geometry of the entire object to match the image texture on top of it. So yeah, obviously, like I said, if you're going to use an actual displacement map, you would want to make sure it was really smooth. Otherwise, the geometry that gets pushed out can be kind of jagged looking as it is here. So what you would want to do was use a separate map for that. And on the actual displacement map, you would probably want to disable the color value so that you're just getting the effects of the displacement on one texture layer. And of course, we made this green. So now that we disabled the color value of this texture, we have just the regular diffuse of the material showing up here. But what you would want to do is click on another texture slot here of this material, press new, and you could use the same image or a different image. So for the displacement map, you would want to have like an edited image that was like smoother, more blurred, so it wouldn't create such, weird spikiness. And then on the second map, you could have the color and normal values activated. That way you're able to use the normal bump mapping simultaneously with the displacement values, maybe you would want to rename this texture displacement and rename this one main color or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Now if we press render preview, we'll get the best of both worlds. We'll get the displacement and we'll get the color mixed with the normal value. So down here we have a lot of blending options and things like that. Where blending this starts to make more sense is when you have a bunch of different textures you're using. So I'll go ahead and click on that displacement and press this X to delete that, and click on this main color, and I'll use this button to shove it back up to be the first one. Then click on this next texture slot. Let's add a new one. And under image, we could pick another image from our seamless elemental sample pack here, say this grass here. And we'd want to make sure that its mapping was using this UV map here. We could close that up. And under the main color one here, and make sure we turn on the intensity value for our stone texture here. And let's change that name from main texture to stone texture so it's a little less confusing now that we're not using it for a displacement example. If these blend values are just set to the default of mix, we'll only ever be able to see one of the color values of these textures at a time. Now you can actually see the bump mapping effect of this stone texture carry over even as we see the grass of the new texture we added, which is cool. But if you wanted to see the colors of these mix, you'll have to bring down either the color value, and notice too that the way that these textures are sort of layered on top of each other is sort of opposite the way Photoshop is. So typically when you think of Photoshop, say you had a layer up here, like say you lowered the opacity of this top layer, then you would expect to see what's under it, where this texture, but it's basically you're looking at it from the opposite end here in Blender. If we were to lower the color value of this grass texture, and we could go ahead and rename this grass texture. So here, if we were to lower the color value of this to say about half, now we can see the actual color of that stone texture showing up through here. Or if we were to adjust this blend value to say overlay or multiply, we're now getting a sweet mixture of this grass texture as well as this stone texture. If you want to temporarily hide one of these texture layers, you can just click the check mark to disable the view of it. And of course, since I did that, this is now multiplying onto nothing, which is not great. So we switch that back to mix. If you want to temporarily hide one of these textures, you can just click this check mark here, which will temporarily hide it. Once again, we're sort of looking through this through like opposite Photoshop layers. So we're thinking about things like as we hide something down here, we're able to see what's above it, which is opposite of Photoshop. I know it's kind of weird if you're used to Photoshop, but if you can just remember that it's looking at it backwards, then it will make a bit more sense. So if I click back on the stone texture, this RGB to intensity, basically what this is saying is, do you want to use the brightness and contrast of the image, but then change the color to, whatever. So if we turn this on, we'll no longer see the actual color of this stone texture, just kind of the highs and lows of the darkness of it. And if I go ahead and turn the geometry off, we can see that a bit better. But then of course we can change this to any color we want. So blue, green, etc. A lot of times texture maps and things will require black and white maps. So this can be useful when you need to, on the fly, turn something into something black and white. So what you would do is activate that, then under RGB, bring all these values up completely, and then you've got the slider here. Of course, this is looking green because our material diffuse is set to green, but we could, switch it back to white. And then, so now we've got this basically white image, although I think this grass texture is, it's, even though we've disabled this, it's some of the effect is showing up through here. I'm not sure what's going on there. But we can use that RGB to intensity to override all the colors of whatever texture or image we're using to make it whatever we want, which is useful. Of course, negative, that's just going to give you the inverse of that image. So if we disable that, we're now getting the negative value of that. Stencil value will allow you to use one texture as a stencil between another. So if we were to go ahead and click on a third texture here and press new, and under image, press open, and then under desktop, pick something else, say these boards here, something like this, and turn this grass texture on. And we could close that up and back under influence, turn on stencil here. Of course, the stencil value is only going to work if you have RGB to intensity selected. I could go ahead and make that white. Now, say if I were to turn on the this geometry normal value, I'm now using this grass texture as a filter between the stone texture and these boards, which we could go ahead and rename. So as you can see, there's a lot of really interesting things we can do by blending and stenciling and mixing these things all together here. So pretty sweet. This dvar value, the D stands for distance, basically trying to gradient the control of all these sliders between all the settings you have set for the material. So if I were to click back on this stone texture and adjust this, this is going to be the underlying value that mixes the material value and things we have set up for this texture, such as the intensity and color. This is the baseline of meshing the material values with each individual texture values. So down here, we just have more bump mapping options, which have to do with this normal value here. One thing I want to mention is that where it says method here, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, so if I want the best looking bump map, I'll change this to best quality, and that isn't necessarily going to do what you think it's going to do. What this setting really refers to is if you were using a really high resolution map, like a large size map, say something higher than 4096 by 4096, or even larger, like say some sort of huge megapixel map or something. If you have a map like that, you'll be able to get higher quality out of it by changing these settings. If you're creating like a game asset or something, and you're using a low resolution map, having this set to low quality will give you better results with that lower resolution map. So it can be a little confusing. And then space refers to the way the normal values, that's the height value of the map, will be calculated. Okay, that about wraps us up. Thanks for watching. I know this video is a bit long, but I hope you learned a lot about texture options and how they really go hand in hand with material options for Blender render materials. And so just keep an eye on one or the other whenever you're working with both, and you should be in pretty good shape. So see you next time.